He doesn't belong here. That's what the executives whispered when Tony Harper stepped onto the helipad with his worn toolbox. They dismissed him without a second thought. But as their prized helicopter sat gleaming in the sunlight, danger lurked beneath its polished exterior. A cracked fuel line, jagged like a lightning bolt, lay perilously close to the ignition coil, one spark away from catastrophe. Tony's discovery wasn't just a repair, it was a revelation. What followed would alter not only his future but also how Miranda Taylor decided who was truly worthy of her trust. Every subscriber means the world to me, and your support keeps these incredible stories coming. If you love heartwarming journeys and unexpected twists, hit that subscribe button and like the video. Also, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below and let's see how far this story has traveled. Tony's life is about to change forever. Tony Harper stepped onto the helipad and felt the weight of every glance thrown his way. The executives, dressed in tailored suits with polished shoes catching the sunlight, stood in a small cluster. Their conversations hushed as Tony approached, his well-worn boots clunking unevenly on the pavement. In his hand was a battered toolbox, scuffed and stained from years of hard use. One man leaned toward another, muttering something under his breath, followed by a smirk. Tony didn't need to hear it clearly to know. He'd been here before. People like them always thought they could measure a man's worth by his appearance, and Tony's faded work jacket and jeans weren't exactly designed to impress. The helicopter loomed in the background, its sleek metallic body gleaming in the sunlight. Its angular design and polished finish screamed wealth and speed, a stark contrast to Tony's gritty, no-nonsense presence. But the executives barely glanced at the machine now. Their attention was fixed on the mechanic who'd been called in last minute. One of them spoke louder than the rest, his voice dripping with condescension. "I can't believe he's the expert we're waiting on." Tony bent down to open his toolbox, staying silent. Years of working in places where he wasn't expected to fit in had taught him to let comments like that roll off his back. He pulled out a small flashlight, checked its battery and began walking toward the helicopter, his movements deliberate. He didn't need to explain himself. By the time he was called to a job like this, it was usually because someone else had already failed. Tony figured this would be no different. The problem wouldn't be obvious to the casual observer, or to the suit-wearing crowd behind him. That's why he was here. One of the younger executives, emboldened by the laughter of the others, stepped forward. "Did someone pick you up from a truck stop? Or do you always show up on jobs looking like that?" His grin was wide, too wide, as if he thought he'd just delivered the joke of the year. The others chuckled, but Tony didn't flinch. He clicked on the flashlight and nodded toward the helicopter. His response wasn't for the young man or his friends. "I didn't come to win a fashion contest," Tony said plainly, his tone neutral but firm. "I came to make sure none of you get hurt trying to fly this thing." The words hung in the air, silencing the laughter. It wasn't aggressive, but it was enough. The younger man's smugness faltered as he stepped back. Tony continued toward the helicopter, ready to begin his work. As he reached the side of the aircraft, he set his flashlight down, running his hand along the body and scanning for any signs of unusual wear. The executives fell quiet, watching with a mix of distrust and curiosity. All except for one, a woman standing slightly apart from the group. She wasn't joining in the ridicule, but her thoughts weren't obvious either. What none of them realized, what Tony could feel in his gut, was that something about the helicopter was off. It wasn't just general wear and tear. There was an energy to this machine that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. When you worked with engines long enough, when you understood machines down to their core, you developed a sixth sense for this kind of thing. Sure, the helicopter looked pristine on the outside, but Tony could tell this wasn't a cosmetic problem. His job wasn't just to fix engines, it was to anticipate. And that's exactly what was gnawing at him now. He unscrewed a panel, exposing part of the helicopter's inner components. The executives shuffled closer but stopped just far enough to avoid getting their shoes dirty. One of them pulled out a phone, snapping a photo of the open panel. Tony barely noticed. He was already deep into observation mode, scanning the wires and connections, noting the wear and discoloration in places it shouldn't be. Something was wrong here, but he needed to dig deeper to find it. Behind him, the group shifted uncomfortably, sensing his focus and seriousness for the first time. The mocking tone had all but disappeared. When Tony worked, he moved differently, smooth, efficient, full of purpose. It disarmed people, made them second-guess their snap judgments. They didn't know it yet, but they were already seeing the side of him they wouldn't forget. One of the executives muttered, "What's taking him so long?" But nobody answered. The tension was shifting. Tony could feel it, though his focus remained on the task at hand. He wasn't here to earn their admiration. If they began to respect him, it would be because he earned it by showing them exactly who he was. He leaned in closer to the internal wiring, flashlight in hand, preparing to uncover what he already suspected might be lurking deeper within. Tony's hands moved with steady precision, tracing along the engine's parts as if he could feel the machine's story through its components. Every connection, every seal, every inch of material told him something. At first, it all seemed routine, until his flashlight beam froze on a single spot. His fingers hovered near it, not from hesitation but from pure calculation. He crouched lower, angling the light, and the full scope of the problem came into view. A crack in the fuel line, thin but unmistakable, spidering along the surface like a fracture in glass. Where the crack ran deepest, the edges were blackened and melted, as though the fuel had been moments away from igniting. Just inches away sat the helicopter's ignition coil, a silent threat waiting to turn the flaw into catastrophe. The smell of corroded metal hit his nose as he leaned closer. This wasn't just wear and tear, it was a ticking time bomb. The crack wasn't superficial, it had weakened the entire line. Under high pressure, the fuel would have sprayed out, mixing dangerously with the heat from nearby components. The ignition coil would have been the spark. One flight at altitude and this machine could have turned into a fireball. Tony clenched his jaw. Whoever had worked on this before had missed the signs. Or worse, ignored them. The gap between the brittle line and the heated coil wasn't intentional engineering. It was negligence, plain and simple. Behind him, the shuffle of feet and murmured voices from the gathered executives continued, oblivious to the danger he'd uncovered. They didn't realize the sleek aircraft before them had been one flight away from disaster. Tony set the flashlight down and ran his hand along the surrounding connections. Corrosion had spread beyond the main fuel line, faint discoloration creeping into secondary components. This wasn't sudden damage. It had been building over time, hidden just long enough to lull everyone into complacency. He stepped back, his mind racing. The crack wasn't the only issue. The entire setup was flawed, a chain reaction waiting to happen. Heat management had been ignored, and now the system was at its breaking point. Tony exhaled sharply. This wasn't just about fixing a problem. It was about preventing lives from being lost because someone had cut corners. "Is this going to take all day?" an executive asked, his voice dripping with impatience. Tony ignored him. They wouldn't understand the severity of what he'd found, and explaining it now wouldn't change their dismissive attitudes. People in suits rarely grasped what it meant to be seconds away from failure. That was why they hired people like him. But Tony couldn't block them out entirely. They stood there, hands in their pockets, chatting casually on ground they didn't realize had been precariously close to collapse. He glanced over his shoulder at the helicopter's owner, standing apart from the rest. Her arms were crossed, but her expression had shifted. She wasn't just watching him anymore. She was studying him. Tony didn't know what she thought, but it didn't matter. What mattered was replacing the line, and fast. Time wasn't on his side, and he didn't have the luxury of a full shop's resources. He cleared his throat and stood up, his voice calm but firm. "Your fuel line is shot. If this had gone up mid-flight, you'd have had seconds to react." His tone was even, almost detached, as if narrating facts. "The crack's bad enough, but its placement next to the ignition coil makes it dangerous." He held their gaze for a moment before turning back to his toolbox. The man who'd been sighing earlier was now silent, his annoyance replaced by wide-eyed apprehension. Tony didn't stop to reassure anyone. He'd already mapped out his plan: replace the damaged section entirely, no patch jobs here, and realign the components to eliminate heat risks. This wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about erasing the negligence that had put lives at risk. Rolling up his sleeves, Tony grabbed a replacement line from his kit and got to work. Every movement was deliberate, his focus unshakable. When someone tentatively asked a question, he answered briefly. "This isn't wear," he said, tightening a connection with practiced efficiency. "This is bad assembly." Whoever worked on it last should have seen this coming. The longer he worked, the quieter the group became. Their skepticism faded, replaced by something closer to respect. Every turn of Tony's wrench, every adjustment made the danger and his expertise clearer. By the time he leaned back to inspect his progress, the tension in the air had shifted. Nobody complained anymore. The silence wasn't dismissive now, it was trust. The situation wasn't fully resolved yet, but they could see what mattered most. Tony knew what he was doing, and with every passing moment he was pulling them further from harm. As Tony crouched beside the open engine panel, his movements were deliberate and precise, each action flowing seamlessly into the next. His hands tightened, tested, and adjusted components with the ease of someone who had done this countless times before. There was no fanfare, no unnecessary gestures, just a quiet intensity that spoke volumes. The executives, who had initially been distracted by their phones and side conversations, began to take notice. At first, a few whispered skeptically, but their murmurs gradually faded as their attention shifted fully to Tony. His focus was magnetic. Every tool he picked up had a purpose, every movement was intentional. There was no hesitation, no wasted effort. He loosened a malfunctioning fastener, replaced it, and secured the new part with a confidence that didn't require validation from the onlookers. His priority was clear: ensuring the helicopter stayed in the air, avoiding the catastrophe that could have resulted from the untreated fuel line. One executive, still clinging to his skepticism, muttered, "He looks like he's patching up an old car, not a multi-million-dollar machine." The comment drew a few half-hearted chuckles, but they quickly died out. The others were too absorbed in watching Tony work. They began to notice the finer details, the steady hands that never wavered even when handling parts requiring millimeter precision, and the instinctive way he double-checked each step. It wasn't guesswork, it was mastery. Whatever their initial judgments about his appearance, it was becoming impossible to deny that Tony knew exactly what he was doing. Then came the moment that silenced even the most doubtful among them. Tony carefully removed the damaged fuel line, threading it out with painstaking care. But replacing it wasn't a simple fix, it was part of a larger issue. As he inspected the surrounding components, he spotted the real problem: a wiring bundle taped too close to a heat vent. It was a shortcut likely done to save time, but it was a dangerous one. The tape had already begun to corrode, and the wires were one bad vibration away from snapping. "This wiring wasn't meant to handle heat exposure like this," Tony said, his voice calm but firm as he pulled away the damaged tape to reveal the extent of the issue. He glanced up briefly, meeting the eyes of the nearest executive. If this casing had failed up there, it could have triggered a chain reaction. The executive, who had been smug moments earlier, now looked visibly uncomfortable. Whether it was Tony's words or the realization of how close they'd come to disaster, the shift in his expression was unmistakable. Tony, however, didn't linger on the reaction. He turned back to the wires, reinforcing the protective casing and repositioning it to a safer area. The group of executives, once so quick to judge, had fallen silent. Even those who had been itching to ridicule him earlier now stood quietly, their expressions softening into something closer to respect. They weren't engineers, but they could recognize the difference between someone fumbling through a task and someone who worked with the precision of a master craftsman. Tony didn't need to explain himself or seek their approval. His work spoke for itself. And then Miranda Taylor arrived. She stepped onto the helipad with a quiet authority that didn't require an announcement. Her presence was immediately felt, though she made no effort to draw attention to herself. Miranda's reputation preceded her. She was known as aviation royalty for good reason. She had flown, built, and raced jets, and her ability to see through pretense made her someone few dared to underestimate. For a moment she simply observed. Her sharp eyes took in the scene, the methodical way Tony worked, the executive's subdued demeanor, and the subtle shift in the room's energy. Her posture was relaxed, but her gaze was piercing, as if she could see what others missed. From where she stood, she could tell that Tony wasn't second-guessing himself. Every movement was purposeful, every adjustment made with the confidence of someone who had mastered their craft. Finally, Miranda stepped closer, her presence commanding attention without a word. The executives straightened instinctively, their earlier mockery now replaced with quiet unease. She didn't address them. Instead, her focus was on Tony. Her expression shifted, not to surprise but to recognition. She saw in him what the others had only just begun to grasp, a level of skill that couldn't be faked. "You've got steady hands," she said, her calm voice cutting through the silence. Tony looked up, momentarily startled. Miranda's tone wasn't condescending or skeptical. It was matter-of-fact, almost admiring. "Not many mechanics handle this kind of pressure without slipping," she added. Tony blinked, caught off guard by the respect in her words. For someone so used to being dismissed, the acknowledgement took a moment to register. In that instant the dynamic shifted again. Miranda's quiet validation carried more weight than any argument or explanation. The executives who had once judged Tony by his appearance now saw him through her eyes. Without raising her voice, Miranda had reframed the entire situation, making it clear that true expertise didn't need to be announced. It simply needed to be recognized. Miranda walked toward Tony with a quiet confidence, her boots clicking softly against the helipad's surface. Unlike the executives, she carried no sense of judgment in her stride, no air of superiority. When she stopped just a few feet away, Tony barely glanced up from his work, too focused on securing a repaired component. She waited until he set his wrench down, catching his attention before speaking, her voice warm but direct. "I'm Miranda Taylor," she said, her tone steady. "And from what I'm seeing, you're the only person here who knows what they're doing." Tony, still crouched by the exposed engine, blinked up at her. The compliment caught him off guard, not just the words but the way she said it. It wasn't flattery. It was a simple, matter-of-fact observation. He wasn't used to being addressed like that, least of all by someone with her reputation and status. "Thanks," he replied after a brief pause, his voice even, avoiding formalities like "ma'am." He gave her a small nod before turning back to his work. Miranda, unfazed by his reserved response, continued. "The crack you found," she started, kneeling slightly to get a better line of sight on what he was working on. "What tipped you off before you even started opening it up? Did you hear it?" Her questions carried curiosity, not doubt, about his technical method. That too felt different to Tony. It wasn't often someone asked him why he knew something without trying to poke holes in his instincts. "It's hard to explain," Tony said after a moment, keeping his eyes on the replacement line he was fitting into its new position. "Machines, when they're off, they still—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "They give off a kind of noise. Not something you hear outright, but you pick up on what's wrong if you've been around them long enough. Little things stick out. The discoloration on the casing was the first sign, but I guess I already knew something wasn't sitting right before I saw anything." Miranda tilted her head slightly, studying him. Behind her, the group of executives shifted uneasily, exchanging glances. Her interest in Tony's work seemed to unnerve them, making their place in the interaction feel uncertain. She noticed their discomfort but didn't address it, staying focused on Tony. "That kind of intuition isn't common," she said. "Especially not anymore with the way everything's automated and overly reliant on diagnostics." Tony looked up again, surprised by the conviction in her voice. He wasn't used to hearing someone in her position value hands-on expertise over data. "It's not intuition," he said, shaking his head lightly. "Not really. I've just been doing this long enough to notice patterns. It's not impressive, it's just experience." "No," she said quickly, her tone firm but not unkind. "It is. I've spent my entire life surrounded by men who talk big and do little. Trust me, what you're doing right now isn't something just anyone would notice, much less know how to fix." Her words hung in the air, loud enough for the executives behind her to hear. The tension rippled through the group even as they tried to keep their postures casual. Tony didn't reply at first. He wasn't sure he'd ever been acknowledged like that, especially by someone like Miranda Taylor. Someone who clearly wasn't reaching for compliments or throwing empty words to sound polite. He focused back on his work, grounding himself in the task. But Miranda wasn't done. She could tell by his reaction that words like hers didn't come Tony's way often, and decided, almost instinctively, that there was more she wanted to know. "You've been doing this your whole life?" she asked, her tone carrying the weight of someone who understood the value of hard-earned knowledge. Tony straightened slightly, wiping his hands on a rag before leaning against the side of the helicopter. "Pretty much," he said after a beat. "My dad ran a workshop. I guess I picked it up without thinking too hard about it. By the time I left high school, it was all I knew how to do." He paused, considering how much to share, but something about Miranda's intent gaze made him continue. Except you don't just fix cars and engines, you learn to keep your head down, make sure people trust you to get it right the first time. When you're from where I'm from, messing up means you don't get another shot. Miranda nodded slowly, her expression softening into a slight smile. You're right, she said. Opportunity isn't a guarantee. I think that's why I appreciate people who do things the way you do. This, she added, gesturing vaguely toward the onlookers, this isn't the standard I hold people to. Her words carried weight, but her expression softened again. When I was little, she began, her voice quieter, we didn't have the money to hire people for repairs. My dad worked 2 jobs, but he'd still spend hours in our garage after dark fixing whatever broke, sometimes holding it together with duct tape and elbow grease. That was my first glimpse of what real work looked like. Not perfect but honest. Tony absorbed her words, reminded of his own dad, who once rebuilt an entire car engine late one night after 2 customers canceled jobs in a row. Without saying it outright, he understood why she looked at things the way she did. Respect, he realized, didn't require wealth or a title. It was built on what you could create with your hands under pressure. The exchange between them was quiet but lingering, gliding over the tensions still thick among the executives. Miranda's words sparked something new between them, a connection neither had expected, built on the common language of grit and craftsmanship. As Tony studied her thoughtfully, something told him their conversation was just the beginning. With the helicopter now repaired and humming back to life, Tony stood off to the side, leaning against the railing of the helipad. He wiped his hands clean with a rag already gray from use, his work jeans smudged with grease. The executives, still gathered nearby, kept their distance, their earlier condescension replaced by a silence that carried an unspoken shift, respect. Miranda Taylor stepped forward, her stride deliberate, her gaze steady. She stopped just short of the executives, facing them with a calm authority that made the group seem smaller. Let's be very clear, she began, her voice cutting through the quiet. This helicopter wouldn't be in the air today if it weren't for Tony Harper. She didn't raise her voice, but the weight of her words silenced even the most skeptical among them. Out of all of us here, he was the only one who understood what needed to be done. The executives didn't respond, though 1 or 2 shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her eyes. Miranda wasn't interested in their discomfort. She turned slightly, her attention landing fully on Tony. You didn't just repair a machine today, she said, her tone softening. You saved lives. And you did it with a skill none of us could have matched. Tony glanced up briefly, his face unreadable, though something flickered behind his eyes. He wasn't used to public praise, especially not in front of people who usually looked down on him. Thanks, he said quietly, his voice steady. For anyone else it might have seemed underwhelming, but Miranda seemed to understand his simplicity for what it was. Genuine. She stepped closer, her tone shifting to something more personal. I've been in aviation my entire life, she said, folding her arms loosely. I've worked with countless mechanics, engineers, teams of so-called experts. But watching you today, she paused, letting the moment stretch, her words deliberate. It's clear you don't just fix things, you understand them. You see through the noise. Her faint smile carried a sincerity that was hard to ignore. That's rare. Tony shifted his weight, unsure how to respond. Compliments from someone like Miranda Taylor didn't feel like flattery. They felt intentional. Still, he nodded, waiting for her to continue. Miranda's expression sharpened slightly, her voice steady but carrying a new weight. Which is why I want to make you an offer. The words hung in the air, heavy with significance. The executives behind her stiffened, exchanging glances, but Miranda didn't waver. Her focus stayed on Tony. You've proven more in one afternoon than most people do in months on my teams, she said, her tone quieter but firm. And I'm not just talking about fixing a helicopter. I mean the integrity it takes to stay calm under pressure, to let your work speak for itself. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. I need someone like that. Someone who can see the bigger picture. Tony stared at her, cautious. What are you saying? He asked, his tone measured. He wasn't one to jump to conclusions, especially not with someone like Miranda. I'm offering you a position, she said plainly, her words direct. I want you as my personal mechanic and advisor. You'd work on my fleet, jets, helicopters, everything I own. She paused, letting the enormity of the offer settle. This isn't just a job, she added, her voice softening. It's a partnership. Tony's grip tightened slightly on the rag in his hands. Your fleet? He repeated, needing to hear it again to process the scale of what she was saying. Yes, Miranda replied, her tone unwavering. You've already proven you're more than capable. This isn't about qualifications, it's about whether you see yourself in a role like this. Tony dropped his gaze, staring at the helicopter he'd just saved as if it might offer him clarity. The offer felt like it came from another world. A fleet of aircraft? Working directly with someone like Miranda Taylor? It wasn't just the size of the job, it was the leap it represented. He'd spent his life in small garages, wrenching away in places he knew inside and out. This was uncharted territory. Miranda seemed to sense his hesitation. I know it's a lot to take in, she said, her tone calm but encouraging. But this isn't about what you've built so far. It's about what I know you could build if you had the chance. Her gaze softened. Think about it, Tony. This isn't just a paycheck or a title. It's about recognizing your value. I see it. And I think part of you does too. Tony exhaled slowly, the swirl of emotions, gratitude, disbelief, even suspicion, settling into something deeper. Miranda wasn't offering this on a whim. She'd seen something in him that most people didn't. Finally, he met her eyes, his expression softening. I don't really know what to say, he admitted. It's a lot. Say yes, Miranda said simply, a faint smile breaking through. The rest will work itself out. Tony chuckled faintly, rubbing the back of his neck. After a beat, he nodded, his quiet certainty unmistakable. All right, he said softly, though the word carried more weight than his tone suggested. Yes. Miranda's smile widened, full of belief and relief. The executives behind her stood frozen, unsure of what had just transpired, but Tony and Miranda knew. This wasn't just a deal. It was the start of something that mattered. Tony's story isn't about fixing a helicopter. It's about transformation. Miranda, with her sharp instincts, recognized what others missed. Character and craftsmanship outweigh appearance or status. The executives, trapped by their assumptions, discovered that true value isn't tied to titles or polished suits but to genuine skill and integrity. How many Tony Harpers do we overlook each day, their potential hidden beneath surface judgments? Tony's journey is like a rough diamond, finally recognized for its brilliance. It reminds us that recognition often comes unexpectedly, and when it does, it can reshape lives, both for those who see and those who are seen.